All right, if you would be making your way in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 3, we're going to conclude the rest of the chapter this morning looking at perhaps what the most well-known story that involves King Solomon. And this is a story that is obviously tied in with the earlier portion of the chapter where Solomon was given a dream by God and he was simply given the opportunity to ask whatever he wanted from God. And we know, of course, from what we saw last week, that Solomon ultimately decides that he'd rather get wisdom from God over anything else so that he could properly rule over the people of Israel. And for that reason, God understood that he did that not for himself, but for the benefit of the entire nation, which was what Solomon's job was. So God not only gives Solomon wisdom, but also riches, honor, and prestige, which will certainly come into play in chapter 4, and as Solomon will deal with the construction of the temple. But in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 through 28, we're given a very difficult decision. If we were to put ourselves in Solomon's shoes, we are given a very difficult decision to have to rule over. And what we're going to point out, at least in this section of 1 Kings chapter 3, is how Solomon properly uses the wisdom that God gave him. It also is going to point out the fact that God's wisdom, of course, is much wiser than the wisdom of man. And that, of course, is reflected because Solomon was specifically given a unique form of wisdom that no other person had. All right, so we begin in verse 16. It says that two women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then it happened the third day after I'd given birth that this woman also gave birth. And we were together, no one was with us in the house, except the two of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was, dead. But when I had examined him in the morning, indeed he was not my son whom I had born." All right, so the difficult situation is you've got two women basically fighting over the body of one living child. The other child had died. We know that in the Old Testament and in other passages throughout the Bible, not just the concept of adultery, but especially, for instance, in the book of Proverbs, there are a lot of warnings given by the writer of Proverbs. Many of those Proverbs were written by Solomon about warning young men about prostitution, dealing with prostitutes. For instance, you can look at Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 26. Proverbs simply said that a man can essentially hire a prostitute for a loaf of bread, but the end result is it's going to cost him everything that he has. And there are other passages, Proverbs, I believe Proverbs chapter 7, Proverbs 26, and there are other minor proverbs sprinkled throughout that book that deal with prostitution, which we know was a sin, and it was something that specifically was a very big problem. And, you know, as some writers have put it, one of the oldest professions in the world was prostitution. But when you notice here, these are two women that are prostitutes that come to the king and they present this request before him. Now, one thing that I will point out about this situation, there are a lot of people in this situation that if they heard what was said here would have simply said, you know, you both got what you deserve. Right? These are two prostitutes. There have been a lot of people that would have been in that situation that said, I'm not listening to this, it's too difficult. And at the end of the day, you got what you deserve, right? Because of how you were living. And sometimes that is a consequence of sin, right? You do suffer, not just spiritually, but sometimes you can suffer physically because of your sins. But there are a lot of people in this situation that would have just taken that mindset, right? I don't have time to deal with you, right? You got what you deserve. Sometimes we have to be careful that we don't adopt that mindset. Obviously we recognize that sometimes people do suffer for the consequences of their sin. But just because somebody is suffering from the consequences of their sin does not necessarily mean that gives us the right to be condescending and hateful toward them. And this passage is a very good reminder of it. Solomon's going to take a situation in which many people would have, just did nothing about, and his ruling is going to be a ruling that not only is going to give praise to the wisdom of God, but it's also going to be a proper ruling that is going to benefit the woman who, of course, was at risk of losing her child. So that's something to keep in mind here, right? Solomon could have been like a lot of other people and just said nothing about it, passed this off to somebody else, but yet he will step in and make a ruling on it. So, again, the scenario is simply, you've got two women, they've given birth 3 days apart. One woman has apparently slept on her child to the point that it suffocated the child and died. The other one is dealing with, and the other woman did everything right, I guess we could say. She didn't kill her child, but then you've got the question about the child being stolen. Now, when you think about this situation, now you might have been in this situation, you might not have, but you could almost imagine how difficult it could be to know that your child has died. I've heard preachers say this before, that I've heard one specific preacher again say before that the hardest sermon he ever had to preach was the funeral of his son, who died. And as he put it, the way that life works, it's supposed to be the son burying the father and not the father burying the son. And I know most of you in here have kids. You can think about it from that perspective, about how difficult it would be dealing with the death of your child. But this is a little bit more than that, because in this particular situation, the woman caused the death of her child. So, as bad as you could feel, knowing that your child has died, in my mind, it would feel a whole lot worse knowing that you were the one responsible for killing your child, even if it was accidental. And certainly you think about the bond between a mother and child, which I think by nature is a lot more in tune than, say, the father and the child, for various natural reasons. But the point is, if you're in that position, you would feel probably pretty awful about what has just happened, knowing that you're the one responsible for the death of your child. And so, how does that affect the woman that has killed her child? Maybe she goes and steals the child because that's her way of coping with what's happened. Maybe she's doing that just out of the shame of having to admit that she killed her child. Whatever the reason may be, this is a very difficult situation because you don't have anything like DNA testing. You don't have the ability to set up any type of crime scene, to gather evidence, again, be it DNA, any type of evidence that could prove who was the real mother in this situation. It doesn't exist. And, obviously in a situation like that, if this happened today, we could easily prove who the mother was by that. But Solomon doesn't have any of that at his disposal. He's got none of that. Nor does he have other eyewitnesses to this occasion. Look for a moment at Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 15. Now, I think we referred to this when we talked about John chapter 8 a few weeks ago. But it's a passage that is relevant in this situation. Deuteronomy 19 verse 15 says that one witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established. Now that also obviously applied to women as well. But the point is that you had to have multiple witnesses to be able to prove that somebody committed a crime. Multiple eyewitnesses to do that. What you couldn't have and use it as evidence that someone committed a crime was a situation of he said, she said, or in this case, she said, right? This is a situation between two women that have a problem with one another. There's no other eyewitness that can come in and say, yeah, I saw this woman come in and steal the living child. None of that is available at this point. So Solomon also doesn't have the ability to bring in other people and, either confirm or deny the story that's being here. That's why we say that this is a very difficult situation for Solomon to be in. It also proves why the wisdom of God is greater than the wisdom of man. The wisdom of man would not have been able to deduce what had happened here. But Solomon, because he's given his wisdom by God, is going to have the ability to make what seemed like a drastic decision and use that as a way of figuring out who the true mother is. So, verse 22, the woman's come in and reported what has happened. The other woman then responds and says, no, but the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son. And the first woman said, no, but the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son. Thus they spoke before the king. So what you have here is, in verse 22, is basically they're arguing between one another right in front of the King Solomon. And that's literally what this is, right? It's a she said thing, right? There's no eyewitnesses. Whichever word, it seems like you have to pick one or the other, and you don't really know which one is telling the truth. Well, verse 23, Solomon steps in and says, this one says, this is my son who lives, and your son is the dead one. And the other says, no, but your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. Then the king said, bring me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king, and the king said, divide the living child in two, and give half to one and half to the other. When you look at this situation, Solomon probably, again, when you're holding judicial matters, there's really not the need for, there's not necessarily you probably got others there, but, Solomon calling in for a sword would not be that uncommon. What he says, though, with the sword is what is uncommon, to divide the living child in two. Now, most people would think that in this situation that the mother would, we would come to the assumption that most people would think that the real mother would not allow her child to die. However, if you look throughout Israel's history, that has not always been the case. For a moment, look at 2 Kings chapter 28 and 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 28 and 29. Second Kings chapter 6, verses 28 and 29. This was the time period where Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, at this point had been, Israel had been divided into two kingdoms. Northern Israel was having to deal with the Syrians besieging the city. And we might remember this famous statement made by the woman, 2 Kings 6, verse 28. The king said to her, what is troubling you? And she answered, this woman said to me, give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son and ate him. And I said to her on the next day, give your son that we may eat him, but she has hidden her son. Now I know that's a very desperate situation, but the point is that sometimes people can be put in such a situation where they didn't have a problem killing their child if it meant to survive. Now, I'm sure most of y'all in here, I think anybody in here, everybody in here obviously finds that finds that as a disgusting act, and we would never want to be put in a situation where we're like that. But there have been people throughout history that have done that very thing. So common sense would say that no one would want to see their child die, but that had happened before. Solomon uses that level of wisdom in this situation. Surely the woman that is the true mother of the child would not kill her son or kill the child. So Solomon then says, bring a sword. We're going to cut the child in half. Notice verse 26 that the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son. And she said, O my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him. But the other said, let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him. So in verse 27, the king answered and said, give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother. And as a result, Solomon's decision, while it seemed very drastic, ultimately resulted in the rightful mother being able to reclaim her child. And again, Solomon recognizes here that he had a responsibility to help in this situation. He recognized that in this particular occasion, that if the rightful mother was deprived of her child and Solomon didn't do anything about it when he could, that would also be a problem for Solomon, right? Solomon had the wisdom to help out, and he chose to help out in this situation. Again, we're reminded of James chapter 4 and verse 17. To him that knoweth to do good and to do it, and to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. So if Solomon had simply just said no to listening to these two women, what probably could have happened is that the rightful mother would have been deprived of her child. And as difficult as a situation as this is, because Solomon stepped in and did the right thing, the rightful mother is not deprived of her child. And as we see in verse 28, all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. So, what you have emphasized in this passage is not just Solomon's wisdom, but also the fact that God intends within his own kingdom, whether that's Israel, whether that's within the church, to see justice being properly administered. Look for a moment at Isaiah chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. It says that many people shall come and say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth a law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And all this talking about the church. Verse 4 says that he shall judge between the nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And if you think about the life of Jesus, which is referred to in this passage, think about the life of Jesus. Jesus had to deal with people that let's look at and just say in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 4, Jesus had to deal with people that did not want to beat their swords into plowing shares. He had to deal with people that did not want to beat their spears into pruning hooks. And that, of course, meaning that Jesus had to deal with people that were at each other's throat that were also supposed to be one within the church, right? Gentiles and Jews. Think about the problems between the Romans and the Jews that lived in Palestine during the life of Jesus. The Pharisees and other religious leaders. There was a lot of tension there. And part of Christ's role as judge is that he helped end those disputes. Right? We can recall, I think, one of the more powerful examples of this, and this refers back to what we read about in Bible class on Wednesday night. But, back in Acts chapter 8, it says that Peter and John, when they went back from dealing with Simon the sorcerer, that they went back to Jerusalem preaching to all the inhabitants in the Samaritan villages that they traveled through. Now, that's pretty wild considering that all the way back in Luke chapter 9, that it was this same John that said to Jesus, "Why do you not call down fire on the Samaritans?" Because at one point in John's life, he didn't care anything about what happened to the Samaritans. Much like the other apostles with the woman at the Samaritan well, they could have cared less about the Samaritans. But by the time you get to Acts chapter 8, you see sort of the fulfillment of that in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 4. Well, why did that develop? Because Jesus knew the importance of administering proper justice. Didn't matter if you were a Jew or Samaritan, you both had the same problem when it came to the problem of sin. Again, which is why those that killed Jesus were offered forgiveness on the cross, offered forgiveness in Acts chapter 2 and the chapters following. So God puts a premium on justice being administered and being administered properly. We also see in this passage that the wisdom of God is much greater than the wisdom of man. That's why in verse 28, and that's the whole point of this story, it's not just to tell a story, but the whole point of this story is that the people know without a doubt that Solomon was chosen by God because they can see it in his wisdom and in the decisions that he made. And that's the entire importance of this chapter, or of this section of chapter 3. It's a reminder that the wisdom of God was much more powerful than the wisdom of man. We don't have to look any further of reminding ourselves of that than the New Testament. We remember that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul was very clear that man counted God's wisdom as foolishness. Right? The idea of Christ going to die on the cross. Man would have seen in that the idea of foolishness. What are you going to accomplish by killing the Savior? But we know, of course, that the wisdom of God was not so much in Jesus' death, but what would happen after Jesus died, being resurrected and ascending to heaven to sit on the right hand of God, while also giving man the opportunity for salvation through the forgiveness of sin. Man's wisdom was not complex enough to understand it at the time. That's why God had to reveal it through Jesus and why it had to be preached. The gospel had to be preached throughout the New Testament. We also remind ourselves, too, that while we're not like Solomon, where God's going to give us a dream and say, "Here you go, Adam. If you want wisdom, if you want all the wisdom in the world, ask for it in this dream." We are reminded of what James said in James chapter 1 and verse 5, where he reminds the reader that if you want wisdom, turn to God. Who gives wisdom to mankind. Again, James chapter 1 verse 5, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him." Now, for Solomon, it worked out where it was in the case of a dream. Obviously, if we ask wisdom from God, God gives it to us through what? Study, His Word, right? If we want to have the wisdom of God, then and make proper decisions, much like Solomon did, we have to do it based according to His Word, which is essentially what Solomon did, right? He knew the whole he said, she said thing, right? He couldn't use that as evidence to find the innocent, and so he used the wisdom given by God to make the right decision. With that being said, are there any comments on chapter 3?
Some things can be measured. You can take a tape measure and measure the length of a desk, or figure out the area of a plot of land. But I don't think you can fully measure the love of a mother for her child. Like you say, here's an example of a mother willing to do whatever to save her child. And you think about mothers who sacrificed, who've worn their old clothes so their child can have new clothes, or mothers who who've done without so that they can provide food for their child. And it's just something, again, only God would know the depth of a mother's love for a child.
Absolutely. And it's that love that in this situation preserved the child from being killed. That's a very, very good point.
You know, Adam, that also proves the point of the love of God for us, in that he would let his son die for us, and the impact that would have. Once we accepted that fact, it changes our life.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Good points. So in chapter 3, we are left with the indication. Everybody recognizes the wisdom of God in Solomon. That's going to lead to him being a proper king, at least for the early part of his life. We come to 1 Kings chapter 4, and the first half of the chapter, really going all the way down to verse 19, essentially the first half of the chapter, is a record of the leadership under Solomon's reign as king. You can find this in other places in the Old Testament. Again, 1 Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles a lot of times will overlap with one another. But let's just look through this. Let's look through these first 19 verses. And again, these are difficult names to read. We'll make a few comments on this, and we'll close probably with verse 20 today. So King Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were his officials: Azariah the son of Zadok the priest, Elihoreth and Ahijah the sons of Shisha scribes, Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud the recorder, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada over the army, Zadok and Abiathar the priest, Azariah the son of Nathan over the officers, Zabad the son of Nathan, a priest and the king's friend, Ahishar over the household, Adoniram the son of Abda over the labor force. And Solomon had 12 governors over all Israel, who provided food for the king and his household. Each one made provision for 1 month of the year. These are their names: Ben-Hur in the mountains of Ephraim, Ben-Decker in Machaz, Shalbim, Beth-Shemesh, and Elon Beth-Hanan, Ben-Hased in Araboth. To him belonged Sako and all the land of Hepher, Ben-Abinadab and all the regions of Dor. He had Tapheth, the daughter of Solomon, his wife, Baina, the son of Ahilud, and Taanach, Megiddo, and all Beth-Shean, which is beside Zeratan, below Jezreel, from Beth-Shean to Abel-Mahala, as far as the other side of Jokneam, Ben-Gaber in Ramoth-Gilead. To him belong the towns of Jair, the son of Manasseh, and Gilead. To him also belong the regions of Argob and Bashan, 60 large cities with walls and bronze gate bars. Ahinadab, the son of Iddo, in Mahanaim, Ahimaaz in Naphtali. He also took Basemath, the daughter of Solomon, his wife, Baina, the son of Hushai, in Asher and Aloth, Jehoshaphat, the son of Peruah, in Issachar, Shimei, the son of Elah, in Benjamin, Geber, the son of Uri, in the land of Gilead, in the country of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and of Og, king of Bashan. He was the only governor who was in the land. Y'all probably didn't think that I would read those names, but I did, as best as I could. All right, so what we notice in chapter 4, some of these names are familiar, right? Zadok and Abiathar, Benaiah, they should sound familiar. We've seen them before. One of the things that Solomon does here that we'll point out is important is that he does keep in place some of the leadership that was under his father David. When Solomon becomes king, he doesn't completely clean house, which again is a wise thing to do. If David was a successful leader and had successful men advising him, then it makes sense to allow those men to stay in position. You know, a lot of times, right, when we have a change in the president, the president's cabinet, who are his closest advisors, whenever you have a change in the president, the cabinet changes as well. Right? It doesn't really matter who the advisors were. A lot of times the president picks somebody who politically is going to think like them. Well, sometimes that can be good, sometimes that can be bad. But in this case, Solomon knew that these men had been important to David, and Solomon allows them to also continue to serve in their positions. Now, remember that Solomon also asked for God for wisdom in how he would rule over the people. Now, we might not pick up on this right away. This may not, seem very obvious to us, but if we notice in verse 7, how is Solomon going to rule over, he asked for God for wisdom to properly rule over Israel, being a younger man probably at the time. One way to help you out there is to set up men under you to rule over different parts of the country, right? He goes and it says, verse 7, that he set up 12 governors over all Israel who had the responsibility of providing food for the king and his household. In 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon did not have the time as king to handle every single dispute like what you saw between the two women fighting over that child. He just doesn't have the time. So, setting up governors over the different provinces of Israel would also help Samuel rule, because it's going to take a lot of pressure off of his shoulders. There's a reason why we have governors within every state in the United States. Their responsibility is making essentially the executive decisions for that state, just as the president makes executive decisions for the entire country, right? It takes responsibility off. It takes responsibility off the leader. And so, all of these men being important because they are going to help Solomon in his rule over Israel. And really, that's the entire point of 1 Kings chapter 4, is just a list of those who helped out King Solomon in what their positions were, whether it was right there in front of the king, like Jehoshaphat, who was the court recorder, wrote the reports and things like that, whether you're serving as governor. All these men were critical in helping Solomon establish and continue to protect Israel at this time. So next week we'll talk about in verse 20 how a lot of people are going to be attracted to the wisdom of Solomon, which is going to bring praise to Israel. It'll bring praise to God, all because of the example of Solomon. With that being said, are there any final comments before we close Bible class this morning?
The wise choice of men under you reflects well. Of course, the opposite's also true. You
Right.
pick somebody that brings you shame, it's a bad reflection on the leaders.
Right. Absolutely. Well, we'll go ahead and stop there, and we'll pick up 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 20 next week.